In 1955, British motorcycles ruled the world, not in the way people say something dominated a market, genuinely ruled it. Birmingham Small Arms, the company everyone called BSA, was supplying roughly 1 in every 4 motorcycles sold anywhere on the planet. Triumph's parallel twins were setting land speed records on the Bonneville salt flats and appearing in Hollywood films. Norton was winning the Isle of Man TT so regularly that engineers from rival nations flew to England just to study how their frames were built. The men running these companies knew it, and that is precisely where the story ends. What happens between 1955 and 1975 is one of the most complete industrial collapses in British manufacturing history. 10 years after BSA's peak, Honda was outselling them by a margin that should have been impossible. 20 years after Triumph's golden era, the factory workers had barricaded themselves inside the building to stop their own management from shutting it down. By the mid-1970s, the British motorcycle industry, which had invented the modern motorcycle, which had taught the world what a motorcycle could be, was effectively gone. The official explanation has always been the Japanese. They came, they built better bikes, they won. That is half true. The Japanese did build better bikes, but nobody in Britain had to let them. The story of what actually happened is a story about what certainty does to a boardroom. How the men who were most responsible for protecting something became convinced that nothing needed protecting. How an industry that could have adapted chose not to. And how a generation of engineers who knew exactly what was going wrong spent years being told there was nothing wrong at all. By the end, you will understand why the greatest threat to the British motorcycle was not Honda. It was the conviction that Honda was not a threat. Walk into the BSA factory in Small Heath, Birmingham in 1952, and everything about the place tells you what Britain thinks of itself. The smell reaches you first. Cutting oil, hot steel, the sharp chemical bite of paint curing in the spray shop. Then the sound. Banks of machines running simultaneously, each doing a precise job in a precise sequence, feeding parts down a line that has been producing motorcycles since before the First World War. And the sight, skilled men in overalls working at a pace the building was built to sustain, inner structures moving down the line, the careful complication of every single machine done by hand. This was not a factory that doubted itself. BSA was not simply a motorcycle company, it was the holding structure that owned Ariel, Sunbeam, and New Hudson alongside its own badges. At its height, the group was producing approximately 150,000 motorcycles per year. The numbers sound modest by modern standards. In the context of global motorcycle production in the early 1950s, they were extraordinary. Triumph, operating out of Meriden near Coventry, occupied a different place in the imagination. Where BSA built volume, Triumph built mythology. Edward Turner's Speed Twin, which had arrived in 1938, had changed what people believed a motorcycle engine could be. The parallel twin became the architecture that everyone else spent years trying to replicate. By the early 1950s, Triumph's Thunderbird was a commercial for British motorcycling that Hollywood could not have scripted more effectively. Marlon Brando wore one in The Wild One. James Dean was photographed with one. The Bonneville was setting records on the Utah Salt that no production motorcycle from anywhere in the world could touch. Norton's contribution was different again. Norton was where engineering precision lived. The featherbed frame developed by Rex McCandless and first raced in 1950 gave Norton a chassis so good that rival manufacturers bought complete Norton frames and installed their own engines in them. That is how good the featherbed was. Competitors stopped trying to build something better and simply purchased the thing they could not beat. 3 companies, 3 distinct identities, one shared conviction, settled in every boardroom, never seriously questioned. We build the best motorcycles in the world. We have built them longest. No one is coming. That conviction was not irrational in 1952. By 1962, it was a liability. Honda arrived in America in 1959 with a motorcycle no one in Britain thought worth worrying about. The Super Cub was a 50 cubic centimeter step-through with a pressed steel frame, an enclosed chain, and an automatic centrifugal clutch. It looked like something designed for a housewife to ride to the market. In the context of the British motorcycles then available in American showrooms, machines that were loud, mechanically demanding, and culturally associated with a very particular kind of rider, the Super Cub was barely visible. Soichiro Honda himself was not a businessman who happened to make motorcycles. He was an engineer who had decided, before the company made its first sale, that last year's machine was already obsolete. The obligation to improve was not a corporate value statement. It was the operating assumption underneath everything the company did. Honda's American distributors were methodical in a way the British manufacturers had never needed to be. They opened a small office in Los Angeles in 1959 with a capital investment that BSA spent more than that on a single trade show appearance. They thought carefully about who was not buying motorcycles and why. They looked at the American market as though it were a problem to be solved rather than a territory to be claimed, and they concluded that motorcycling had been marketed almost exclusively to people who were already motorcyclists. The campaign that followed changed everything. In 1963, working with the advertising agency Gray Advertising, Honda ran what would become one of the most analyzed marketing campaigns of the 20th century. You meet the nicest people on a Honda. Clean graphics, smiling people, suburban riders. A motorcycle presented not as rebellion or danger or mechanical complexity, but as transportation. The message was not about the motorcycle, it was about who could ride one. America heard it clearly. By 1960, Honda was selling approximately 50,000 units per year in the United States. By 1965, that figure was closer to 500,000. The men in Birmingham read these numbers. They decided the numbers meant something different than what they meant. The reasoning, reconstructed from what the executives said at the time and from what they failed to do in the years that followed, went approximately like this. Honda was selling to people who were not motorcyclists, people who wanted small, quiet, unthreatening machines for short urban journeys. That was not the market BSA served. BSA served real motorcyclists, men who wanted real machines. The Japanese might have the commuters and the college students, and that was fine, because none of those people were going to buy a Gold Star or a Bonneville anyway. It was the cleanest possible example of a correct observation producing a fatal conclusion. BSA was right that Honda's early American customers were not BSA's existing customers. What they failed to understand was that Honda was not trying to take existing customers. Honda was creating new ones. And new customers, once they become motorcyclists, do not stay on 50 cubic centimeter step-throughs. They grow into larger machines, and by the time they were ready for larger machines, Honda would have larger machines waiting. Think about what that actually means. The men in Birmingham had watched Honda build an army of future motorcycle buyers and decided it was irrelevant because those buyers were not yet purchasing British. The boardrooms could have disagreed about markets. What they could not honestly disagree about, if any of them had looked, was engineering. Here is what I find genuinely remarkable about this period. The gap between British and Japanese motorcycle engineering was not hidden. It was not something that required specialist knowledge to identify. Any competent mechanic who stripped a mid-1960s Honda and a mid-1960s BSA side by side could tell you in 15 minutes exactly what he was looking at. British motorcycle engines, with a handful of exceptions, used vertically split crankcase halves. The two halves of the engine casing joined along a vertical seam running front to back through the center of the engine. This design was effective and had been the British standard for decades. It had one persistent consequence. That vertical seam, under the heat and pressure of a running engine, leaked oil. Not catastrophically, but persistently. British motorcycle ownership in this era included, as a matter of course, a spreading patch on the garage floor, and the understanding that wiping down the lower half of the engine was simply a routine maintenance task. Honda used horizontally split cases. The engine halves joined along a horizontal seam, and when the engine was hot and the oil was circulating, that joint stayed sealed. Not mostly sealed. Sealed. Honda motorcycles did not leak oil as a matter of course, because they had been designed with a sealing geometry that the British industry had never adopted at scale. That is one example. There are others. British factories in the early 1960s were running on machinery that had, in some cases, been installed in the 1930s. The production tolerances that resulted were, by modern standards, inconsistent. A BSA engine built on a Monday and a BSA engine built on a Friday were not identical in the way that two items produced by the same tooling should be. The vibration was small, but it was present, and it showed up as the vibration that British motorcycles were known for, as the minor reliability complaints that owners absorbed as part of ownership, as the occasional machine that ran perfectly, and the occasional machine that did not quite. Japanese factories had been rebuilt, largely with American financial support after the war, using modern tooling. Mathematical precision was not an aspiration, it was the output. The response from British boardrooms in meeting after meeting through the 1960s was a version of the same thing. Our customers expect a certain character from a British machine. The vibration is part of the experience. Our riders are not looking for an appliance. They are looking for something with soul. There is a story repeated by several engineers who were working in the industry at the time that captures what this position actually cost. A young engineer presented a proposal to senior management at one of the major manufacturers for a redesigned engine casing that would solve the oil sealing problem permanently. The response from the board was that the company already built the best motorcycles in the world and that publicly addressing oil leaks would imply to customers that oil leaks had been a problem, which would raise questions the board had no interest in answering. The engineer did not implement his proposal. The floor continued to leak. On the 22nd of October 1968, Honda stood on the stage at the Tokyo Motor Show and unveiled the CB750. This is not the moment historians argue about. The CB750 is almost universally agreed to be the single machine that drew the line between what motorcycles had been and what they were about to become. It is worth being precise about why. The CB750 was a four-cylinder, four-stroke motorcycle with an overhead camshaft, a disc front brake, and an electric starter. It produced approximately 67 horsepower from 736 cubic centimeters. It was smooth, reliable, fast, and in the American market, priced at around $1,500. Triumph's Bonneville at that same moment produced roughly 50 horsepower and required a kickstarter to fire the engine. The Bonneville was a magnificent machine. Anyone who tells you otherwise has not ridden one, but it was a machine designed in the 1950s, now competing against something designed for the 1970s. Here is what I find quietly important about the CB750 announcement. It was not a surprise to everyone in the British industry. Several engineers who attended the Tokyo show or received technical specifications in the weeks that followed understood immediately what they were looking at. They went back to their companies and wrote reports. Those reports described an engine architecture that British manufacturers could not match without significant investment in new tooling and new design programs. The reports were received, they were discussed, and then the discussion reached the part of the meeting where investment figures were presented and the meeting moved on. BSA's position in 1969 was this: the company was profitable, the existing product range was selling, there was no crisis visible from the boardroom window. The motorcycles were leaking oil, the tooling was aging, the Japanese were advancing, and the engineers were worried. None of that reached the level that required urgent action because the company was still making money. Companies that are still making money rarely believe they are in trouble. The irony here is almost too clean. The very commercial success that should have funded the modernization BSA needed became the argument that modernization was unnecessary. Profit, in this case, was the thing that killed the company. Not immediately, over a decade, but the mechanism was already running. In 1971, BSA and Triumph's parent group made the decision that was supposed to save them. Umberslade Hall, a Victorian country house in Warwickshire, was converted into a centralized design and development center. The intention was rational and modern, consolidate engineering resources, develop new models on a coordinated basis, create the machines that would take BSA and Triumph into the next decade from a position of planned investment rather than reactive scramble. The machines that emerged from Umberslade Hall were the BSA Rocket 3 and the Triumph Trident. Three-cylinder motorcycles designed to compete with the CB750 and the other Japanese machines that were now arriving in the American market in volume. On paper, a credible response. In practice, almost everything had gone wrong somewhere in the development process. The new machines arrived 44 pounds heavier than the competition. 44 pounds sounds like a number until you sit on the motorcycle and feel what it means to the handling. The engines vibrated in ways that the engineering team had flagged internally and that had not been resolved before the launch date. The electrical system supplied by Joseph Lucas, which had provided a steady source of industry humor for years, continued to deliver exactly the standard of reliability they always had. The American dealers who received the first shipments reported back to Birmingham with specific complaints. The engines were leaking, the electrics were failing. The vibration was unacceptable by the standards their customers now had access to every day in a Japanese showroom next door. The response from Birmingham was to question the competence of the American dealers. Bernard Hooper, who managed BSA's North American distribution at the time, would later describe a meeting in which he presented a detailed written report of dealer feedback, model by model, fault by fault, and was told by a senior executive that American dealers did not understand British engineering and therefore their feedback should be treated with appropriate caution. The American dealers understood exactly what they were selling. What they understood, and what the Birmingham boardrooms could not allow themselves to understand, was that it was no longer good enough. This is the moment I find most painful to read in the historical record. Not the collapse, not the factory closures. This meeting, a room full of people who had been given every piece of information they needed to act, and chose instead to question the people delivering it. In September 1973, the workers at Triumph's Meriden factory refused to leave. This was not a strike in the conventional sense. Strikes stop production from happening. What the Meriden workers did was occupy the factory and continue limited production on their own terms. They had learned that the management of Norton Villiers Triumph, the conglomerate that now owned the Triumph brand, intended to close Meriden and consolidate manufacturing elsewhere. The workers believed, with some justification, that the closure would not save the British motorcycle industry. It would simply reduce it to a scale that management could more conveniently oversee. The blockade lasted 18 months. For 18 months, workers maintained the building, organized politically, lobbied Parliament, and refused to vacate the factory while politicians and executives argued about what the future of British motorcycling should look like. Here is what strikes me about the Meriden blockade. The workers were not wrong about the motorcycles. The Triumph they were defending, the parallel twin that Edward Turner had designed in 1938 and that had been developed through successive iterations ever since, was still a commercially viable machine. The American market still wanted Bonnevilles. There were customers who specifically wanted a British motorcycle and would pay for one if it was reliably available. What the workers could not solve was everything outside the factory gates. They could build the motorcycle. They could not fix the investment deficit that had been accumulating for a decade. They could not repair the quality control failures that had damaged the brand's reputation in the American market. They could not replace the tooling that management had deferred replacing, the export infrastructure that had been allowed to deteriorate, or the engineering programs that had been shelved because the profit figures looked acceptable in the short term. Dennis Poor, who ran Norton Villiers Triumph and who made the decision that triggered the blockade, is a figure worth a moment's attention. He was a racing driver turned industrialist who had managed Norton's parent company through several difficult years. He was not careless, and the decision to consolidate production was not made without reasoning. What it was too late. The industry had needed that kind of structural decision 10 years earlier, when there was still enough capital and enough market share to restructure from a position of strength. In 1973, it was a choice between different versions of decline, and the workers in Meriden, for all their courage, were defending something that management had already made indefensible. The Meriden workers won the immediate argument. A workers' cooperative took over production. That cooperative produced Bonnevilles for 8 more years, a remarkable achievement by any honest standard, before finally closing in 1983. But a cooperative could not replace what the boardrooms had failed to build. It could sustain a beloved machine. It could not rebuild an industry. By 1975, the numbers told the story that no one in Birmingham had been willing to hear. BSA had reported a loss of nearly £8 million in 1972. For a company that had been supplying a quarter of the world's motorcycles 2 decades earlier, that was not a warning sign, it was a verdict. The group collapsed. Triumph continued in diminished form through the cooperative. Norton limped forward under a series of different owners and several attempts at revival, none of which produced a sustained manufacturing operation. The brands survived on paper, transferred between holding companies and licensing arrangements, while the factories, the machinery, the accumulated manufacturing knowledge, and the skilled workforce dispersed into other industries or simply retired. The American market, which had been British motorcycling's most important export destination, now belonged almost entirely to Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, and Kawasaki. The market share that BSA and Triumph had held in the early 1960s had not been competed away slowly. It had collapsed over approximately a decade, and once it was gone, there was no mechanism to recover it. Honda sold approximately 300,000 motorcycles in the United States in 1975. BSA, by that point, had stopped production. Here is the payoff to everything this story has been building toward. The British motorcycle industry was not destroyed by superior Japanese engineering alone. Engineering can be matched. It can be bought, licensed, copied, and improved upon. Engineering is a problem that money and time and genuine commitment can solve. What destroyed the British industry was the decision, repeated in boardroom after boardroom through the 1960s, that engineering did not need solving. The oil leaks were character, the vibration was soul. The Japanese were selling to people who were not real motorcyclists. The CB750 was impressive, but the Bonneville had history. Every one of those statements was, in isolation, defensible, and together they constituted a refusal to look clearly at what was happening. The men running these companies were not fools. They were experts, deeply experienced in their industry, with legitimate reasons for many of the positions they held. They had built these companies over decades. They knew these machines the way you only know something you have spent a working lifetime with. They were also wrong, and the consequences of being wrong, in an industry with the capital requirements and the competitive dynamics that motorcycle manufacturing demands, do not arrive slowly. When they arrive completely. The arrogance that destroyed the British motorcycle industry was not the loud arrogance of people who thought they were invincible. It was the quiet arrogance of people who thought that what they had built was too good to fail, and that particular kind of certainty, the certainty of past achievement applied to a changing present, may be the most dangerous thing a company can carry. In 1990, a builder named John Bloor purchased the rights to the Triumph name from the receiver handling the cooperative's bankruptcy. He did not buy a factory. He did not buy tooling or machinery or any of the accumulated physical infrastructure of a manufacturing operation. He bought a name and the reputational weight that name still carried after everything that had happened to it. Over the following year, he built a new factory in Hinckley, Leicestershire. He hired engineers. He started from scratch, which in this context means he started from the same place Soichiro Honda had started in 1948. With the intention of building the best motorcycle his team could design, using manufacturing processes that were current rather than historical. The first Hinckley Triumph rolled off the production line in 1991. It was a modern 3-cylinder motorcycle with modern engine architecture, modern sealing geometry, and modern electrics. It did not leak oil. This is a success story in the specific way that building something from nothing is always a success story. The Triumph that exists today is a competent, genuinely well-regarded manufacturer that sells motorcycles across the world. The name means something. The machines are good. But stand on a map of the British Midlands and mark where the industry was in 1955. And what John Bloor built is a single point in a landscape of absence. Small Heath, where BSA built motorcycles for 100 years, is no longer a factory. The site has passed through multiple different lives since the last motorcycle left it. The Birmingham Small Arms Works that supplied a quarter of the world's motorcycles does not make motorcycles or much of anything else. Meriden, where the Triumph workers held the factory for 18 months, was demolished. An estate of houses stands where the production line ran. There is a small memorial, occasionally visited by people who know what it marks. The Norton factory at Bracebridge Street in Birmingham was cleared long ago. The men who built those machines, the tool setters and frame welders and engine builders and test riders, who knew those motorcycles in the way that only comes from building something with your hands every working day, grew old and retired. Most of them are gone now. Close your eyes for a moment and think about what that factory floor actually was. The smell of it in the early morning cutting oil and overnight metal before the machine started up. The way the floor shook when the presses were running at full production. The sound of a feather bed frame being aligned, the fitter's mallet, precise and quick, finding the adjustment by feel more than measurement. An apprentice being handed his first engine casing and being told simply to learn the weight of it, because you should know a thing before you build it. Open your eyes. That is all gone, not slowly, gone over a decade, because the men above it believed it could not end. The Japanese manufacturers who took that market understood something the British boardrooms never quite accepted. Soichiro Honda's philosophy, stated plainly and repeated throughout the company's early years, was that the obligation to improve had no terminus. There was no point at which you had built something good enough that you were released from the obligation to make it better. Last year's motorcycle was already obsolete. The job was always to make something better than what already existed. BSA's philosophy in the years that mattered most was that they had already made something better than everything that existed. Only one of those convictions had a future. If you ever heard a Bonneville fire on a cold morning, or stood in someone's garage with a BSA gold star and understood what those machines were, leave it in the comments. The people who were there when those factories were running are the only ones who can tell us what we actually lost, and it was considerably more than market share. Subscribe before you go. These are the stories worth telling before the people who lived them are gone entirely.